This is my hostel in Athens. It's called City Circus. You can see the name there. Looks like a completely newly remodeled building. In that section there with that very lovely, looks like metal and glass porch ceiling or roof, if you will, is probably going to be converted into a bar. Down here to the left, where that one was coming from, is where I would normally walk back to Monastirika Square, which is the main square where the metro station is. But I'm going to go the other way this morning because I'm in search of not only starting my walk around Athens, Rick Steves walking tour at Syntagma Square, but I want to find a place where I can buy a cell phone SIM card. And for the record, it's about 7 o'clock on Wednesday, April 1st, 2015. This is an old funky part of Athens. Not that I've seen the rest of it because I haven't. Loaded with graffiti. Some of it interesting. We're on Stadio Way, or street now, one of the main streets that ties into Emu Street. It's interesting to get up early in the morning. That's when you see things, people coming alive, shops coming alive. Look at that interesting facade. Reminds me of Zion's hanging gardens, if you will. These are a couple of meat shops here. And even something here I noticed, well, that looks like honey and various spices. And behind me is, again, various kinds of spices, rices, and so forth. And perhaps even a picture of the owner's grandfather or something like that. These folks are a little more health conscious than the last place that had a couple of pigeons roaming around in those baskets. More interesting shops, these for plants and seeds and probably herbs. Same thing behind me. Got a little Wincy from Disney, I suspect. This is Athenas Boulevard, I believe, one of the streets that ties into Emu, in between Monastiriki and Syntagma Square. But I just was captivated a bit by this beautiful, looks like, it reminds me of 18th century, or 19th century, excuse me, building design and that lovely metalwork. But this is advertising Christmas, apparently. Here, a really big seed shop. Like so many older towns, you find the same kind of businesses tend to be clustered together on the same street or in the same section of the street. And yet here, somebody's little appliance shop, maybe even a repair shop. Why you get up early in the morning to see this kind of an arcade for various kinds of meats. Anything and everything that you need for business or for the housewife. You'll see displays like this in the United States. And here we're at some kind of an intersection. Notice what a beautiful building this is. How old it is, I don't really know. But it's certainly made out of heavy metal. But all modernized by EU standards. And this is apparently was a side arcade that we were on, because now we're going to enter into what looks like the original main market. Too cool, too cool. What you travel for to see this kind of stuff. Now we're in the fish section, obviously, duh. Octopus, the country surrounded by water, or much of it anyway. Not hard to imagine the history of experiences you would have had at this intersection over time. Probably all of this is markets of some sort. How recently this is all built out, I don't know. But we've just come through the building that's to my right. So let's orientate ourselves. We started where it says, I think, Pasiri, down where my thumb is in the left-hand corner. And that's where my hostel is, where the circle is. Walked up where my little arrow is to indicate this street here. Down here to the Central Market, which we just walked through. And I think I've just come up Athenas to this square here. And I'll pan about so you can see it. A good-sized square, not one of the most popular, at least for the tourist. But in its time, and even today, somewhat impressive in an old town sense. An interesting sculpture. The one good sense I get of this old part of town is it wouldn't take much of a revitalization of their economy back to normal, which probably in parentheses is the great issue, to restore this town into perhaps its intended beauty. Wonder what that hearse-like vehicle make is. Again, I can never look at these cemeteries without reflecting on the irony of believing because you have garbed yourself in stone, somehow you will last out eternity and someone will actually care. Neither of those goals ever achieved. So I'm right there at the intersection of Stadiu and Pesimahuli, or whatever it is, below. Right where that intersection, where that Y is. Right dead center right now. And we'll look at some photographs from the early days. (2009) on the left, 1956, 61, 1959. It looks cleaner, but that may be the photography. It's actually a very nice building, but behind me is another building that was more elegant and older looking, but great disrepair. $45 to $50. It's interesting to think I was 5 to 10 years of age during this period. (1920) 1912, 1900, 1895. So I'm right where my thumb is right now, where that green spot is. I'm in the lower corner of that green part there. I just came up that street, Stadio, which would be from the lower right to the upper left. And last night I walked through here, but it was dark and I didn't realize this is where I walked through. So we'll take a closer look at it. And what we're taking a closer look at is that top one, Monos Square. And we'll continue to walk down Stadio, which is along its right side as we're looking at it here, past Colostrone Square down to Syntagma. But first let's take a look at the square we walked through last night. This is actually a very beautiful, graceful, monumental statuary. Uplifting, as you can see, balletic ballet in nature, but unfortunately covered with bird shit and graffiti. It reflects pretty much Athens, unfortunately. All around me are people who are the homeless. No big surprise. It's true in any city, but it'll be particularly true here, although I haven't seen it in great profusion. There is the National Bank of Greece. And before I continue on my journey to the right back to Syntagma Square that I started at last night, I'm going to walk across the street and find out what that building is back there, which looks impressive. I'm going to pan this section of Greek-looking buildings, although I have no idea what it is at this point in time. It should come as no surprise that that's a replica of Athena Promasia, I think, that used to stand on the Acropolis and could be seen from miles out to sea. So the buildings we just looked at are right here. Which one is which I don't know, except the one on the far left was, I believe, the National Library. Man, Korai is the street that I walked up, and here's that square where we saw the lovely but tarnished sculpture, and I have had something to eat here in Starbucks where I'm sitting right now. And we'll continue on down this way to Syntagma Station and Syntagma Square. This is that square we were at a moment ago that I go through last night. And these, I think, are some of the old wealthy homes, at least what's left of them. This is more than a home, of course. This is the National Historical Museum and a monumental statue under restoration now. This is right near Syntagma Square. This is Syntagma Square and the metro station. That is the Hotel Britannia, which apparently, I'm not sure whether it was a hotel or whether this is part of, and all of these are old wealthy homes that were put up in the 19th century to fawn, if you will, to the king at the time. They're not impressive. The square is unimpressive. It'd be a minor square anywhere else in the world. Behind is the Parliament, which is remarkably modest. A modest fountain. This is a European Space Agency exhibit. Very general in its context and in its information, really. You get a sense, and I get a sense as I wander in just this first day here in Athens, that this is a wrecked economy and a wrecked city. There's particular sadness for me here compared, for example, to Egypt. This, a great past, it seems like, and yet because of the corruption, because of the squandering of the billions it received from the EU, it hasn't improved, and it's questionable how it will ever recover. Up there is Syntagma Square. And this is Emu Street, the main shopping street for at least tourists and the average Athenian. Over to my right are three other streets that we'll look at that are apparently where the locals like to shop. This is that small church that I showed the name of a moment ago. It's right in the middle of Emu, so you have to go around it, but it's a blessing because it's one of the few truly unique things to see on this little bit of a trip. What's interesting is the intricacy of some of the stonework. Who knows how recent any of it is. I don't know how recent this metalwork on the windows is, but it's an interesting Christian motif, of course. Just a smattering of the detail that remains, and who knows for sure that this was originally in this position on this building. Again, you wonder how long this has been here, whether it's original and what its purpose was. Large dogs lie about in Athens tranquilly, avoided by people in the sense that they're well protected. And it's in reasonably original condition, it seems like, on the inside, particularly that large dome is very pretty with the paintings on the ceilings. And here the long view down the pedestrian street of Imu, down to Monastiraki Square. This is 54 Imu Street, and that's the name of the mall, 54 Imu. Very pretty building. How much may be original? This church is interesting. Dark, lots of brass. And what they have is for side chapels like you'd find on the aisles in a cathedral are individual pieces of furniture, and in the center of a frame at the top, or in the middle, like a hall tree, will be a silver scene relief that's been made with holes where there would be faces. Presumably in the past there were paintings of some sort of the individual saints that, or whatever, that those personages in that relief were supposed to represent. And what the people do when they come in is they, I don't know if they're saying any prayer at all, but they go up and touch their nose to the panel in some kind of respect. We're visiting now is the Library of Hadrian, built in 132 to 134 AD. What you're apparently going to see is the front right-hand side in this picture, at least the left-hand side of that front side. And this is what its diagram would have looked like. So these columns would have been our entryway right here. Some of them restored or rebuilt, as well as some of the steps to give us an idea. But an impressive structure, not to mention its attribute to the community at its time. Notice that these restored columns are fluted, and in an interesting way, if that's the way it was actually done, it appears so. If that's an original there, is it was fluted more elegantly towards the bottom and less so towards the top. Of course, only this one has any evidence of what the capitals would look like. And I think these are Ionic, because they look so fundamentally simple, although perhaps they're Doric. And then these 7 columns that flanked the entryway. Notice how strong and substantial are the columns there. They're capitals and whatever you define that structure if it were completed as being. I'm guessing that some of these may be original, if not all, simply because they've been banded subsequently to prevent them from splitting apart. I'm assuming that this rockwork was just some cheesy fill-in for the original stonework. Probably this whole thing was then reconstructed, I'm guessing, although most of what we're looking at right now looks like it's original in situ. And I'll pan slowly across these 7 capitals and you'll see that there appears to be a difference. The first 2 there seem to be the same. This third one seems different than the first 2. And then this 4th one in the center seems different than the prior 3. It looks like maybe the 5th and the 6th, maybe even the 7th are the same. These look different. It was not uncommon at one point in time for them to mix those styles of capitals, Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian. Here in this informal lapidarium we get a close look at some of the other stone elements. Call them elements, but they're pretty substantial structures in themselves. You can see these holes that were used for securing and stabilizing the stones that went on top of them. And notice that this one has some kind of wording on it and it looks like Greek. Probably this is somewhat like cabinet makers use. I don't know what the term is, but that wedge, if you had a companion wedge above it, that would allow for there, for example, to be a metal chunk that went in there to lock these 2 drums together. This looks like part of that triangular design that sits on the top of these buildings. Excuse my unsophisticated knowledge. Some of the reassembled remains of the columns on the right side of the entryway and their pedestals. So this would have been the facade, and looking back this way, and maybe some of those walls are part of it, was the main part of the library. And this is some excavation. What it represents, I don't know. Although that looks like some kind of pebbly room surface, room floor surface. And now we'll enter into it from the side of the front entranceway, which you can imagine people walking in through here. Now we'd be going into the library proper, I guess. And it would have ranged back in through there to the far end of that wall, I'm guessing. Notice this little ditch, if you will. I wonder if that was a rainwater runoff. So we're not standing even quite in the center yet of that compound. This will give you an idea of how huge it was. Those walls giving some idea of the limits of it. Now apparently in the midst of this confusion was this Taraconch church. Without taking a lot of time to read through this, it appears that this may have been the evolutionary stages that it went through over time. A pan around, and maybe these curves like this one here and over there and then there give some hint as to that design that we just saw. Dogs that roam around here just seem to be on permanent retirement status. They, like old men, they apparently eat somewhere because they certainly look healthy, and then they just spend the day walking about as they choose, whimsically lying down when they choose. Here I would think would be what looks like iconic simplicity, except that the iconic columns I do not believe had bases on them, whereas these do. Here again, some sense of that altar, rounded altar end of any church, but here there's multiple such rounded altar ends. Notice the thickness of this wall here. The interior courtyard was surrounded by 110 columns. These must be part of that. At least these right here. Those are probably lapidarium. Look at the big turtle. That's cool. Wonder what his role in all of this is. He alternately stops and grazes on these flowers, I think. He walks with a bit of a gimp. Assuming that's not turtle-like in nature. The gimp. This is was the main east room of Hadrian's library. Given what we see in some huge libraries in the United States or elsewhere, can we imagine what it might have looked like? Were these stones original here? Did you feel the weight of man's knowledge when you were working away underneath these huge stones? Up there, the Acropolis, in case you haven't noticed. This must be that east wing area that we're looking at. Doesn't look too impressive in this picture, does it? This corner that we'll look at in a moment was called the Auditoria, and there were two of them, and they were small little lecture halls, if you will. You can see the outline there. So we'll pan up to it, past this Capitol of some sort. You can see how in later times, probably somewhat recently, and other structures were built into that wall, or what was left of that wall. Here's some more of the drainage system. Notice how this drains the surface up on top, then it drops down below to a lower chamber to drain out. Even here, a drain hole. Probably drainage was critical to preserve the structure. And the Acropolis up there. The remains of some of those columns, notice they're different thicknesses. Probably different thicknesses for different size structures, if you will, within this complex. It's interesting in this lapidarium to look at some of the detail. Imagine again, as I did when I think when I was down at one of the Mayan structures like Palenque, marveling at, oh, two more turtles. That's interesting. But marveling at what the men would have thought who carved each of these devices, if they could have known their history in the future. At least they've gotten some immortality, and that they're not literally thrown away or thrown into some wall to be hidden for another chunk of eternity. I hope I haven't forced them into the quandary of how do two guys fit into that one hole. This is often the fate of prior works. Imagine the labor that went into that Capitol. It's now embedded in that wall for who knows how long. Although it's at least covered with a piece of metal to protect it for the future. This is interesting, some original mosaic. Oh, it looks very typical cathedral-like. The altar back in this area somewhere. Notice there would have perhaps been columns lining all around this archway. And then behind the altar, this area back here curves. It's interesting that back in here, all of this flooring at this grade perhaps had this very pretty tile work or mosaic work. Leaves probably, but here you still see the colored stones. Once again, looking at the design of this church, you can see the source of those curved sections. Notice that there's the larger curved section on the right and then the inner curved section, which may be what we just saw. Of course, the same thing reflected in these two drawings from right and then the left one. These stones here perhaps reflect the detail of how you interlock stones together to reduce movement and shifting. The remains of a rather, what I think are called amorphae, designed to hold oil or wine. Another set of ruins not far from the entrance to the ancient agora. I have no idea what it is, but that would look like it's the entrance of a building there. It's not much you can make out when you're not an architect. That may have been an alleyway, do you think? Or a street? But are these individual structures, of course, but are these foundations or are these actual walls? If so, that looks like a sewer right there of some kind of clay material. Is that just some rock pile there in the middle of what otherwise would be a street? Some pedestals for columns that we see. Here's another pretty little church right at the base of the street that I think goes up to the Acropolis. May not be as old as the earlier one we saw because this is in such great condition, I'm guessing that. This church is, I'm sure, much newer, and it doesn't have, I don't think, any of the painting on the inside. It used to have painting, I think, on the dome, inside of the dome, but it's all gone, if it ever was there. I wonder if this difference in height, probably about 10 feet, reflects the infill over the centuries since this was built. This caught my attention because it has a little bit of the look of what might have been an earlier time, early 19th century perhaps.